And one analogy that you gave and metaphor that I like is that 100 years. What are we going to think about in 100 years looking back? What are the historians going to talk about? And I imagine us, we're around tables, we're almost sharing a meal together. And I'm imagining and hoping that in 100 years we'll be sharing a meal together like this. And we'll be having the recipe of Canadian space launch industry. We'll be discussing it together. And we'll be thinking, okay, what did we do 100 years ago that led us to that point? Well, we will have started the ingredients of that recipe. We'll be in the kitchen, we'll be cooking. We'll be cutting the vegetables and preparing the aromas that brought us to this moment. Well, we are 100 years earlier, and we will be talking about those ingredients today. And those ingredients for me are students and startups. Because it starts with that. It starts with cutting the vegetables in the kitchen. Taking your zucchinis, your unpurified ingredients, and training them, giving them the resources, cooking them, bring them to the right temperature, and then giving them a fertile ground, which is startups, to grow and make the recipe that we'll enjoy in 100 years. And to do that, to start this recipe, well, it's already started, I'm not in control of it, we will discuss it and we will talk about it with a panel of some amazing colleagues of mine that I'm very happy to introduce now. And so I'll introduce them and then I'll invite them on stage to start the conversation. Let's start with Oleg. So, Oleg, I had the chance to chat with him a few times. Like I said, I'm an alumni of the McGill rocket team. And so all the rocketry teams in Montreal were quite close, and Oleg, being from Concordia, has helped us quite a bit. And so he's always been a reference for us in our times of dire need. And so Oleg Khalimonov is the program lead of the Star Sailor project at Concordia University, where he leads the team behind Star Sailor, the largest all-Canadian rocket ever built, scheduled for its first launch to space later this summer. Note that I didn't say student rocket, just rocket in general, Canadian rocket, but it is a student rocket. Oleg is a founding partner of Polaris Aerospace, a company dedicated to advancing Canada's success in space through business and technical consulting. As for Adam already spoke to us today, but as you guess, he is a little bit of the lighthouse of student rocketry in Canada. I think pretty much every student rocketry team that's presenting here today, we have U-Ottawa, we have Waterloo, we have people from a little bit everywhere. If you get a chance to talk to them, it's always very eye-opening. They all know about Adam. They've always had the chance to get some mentorship or some advice from him. And so Adam Trumpour, like we mentioned, is a propulsion expert with 14 years of experience at Pratt & Whitney Canada and extensive involvement in rocket engineering. Most importantly for this panel, he is the founder and president of Launch Canada, the country's largest advanced rocketry competition and grassroots development initiative. Adam has also consulted for Transport Canada and Nova Scotia Environment on launch safety and propellant regulations as an authority on liquid rocket propulsion. So we have some great expertise on the panel today. As for our last panelist, Bruno, he might not remember, but we did meet before. In 2021, I was interning at Reaction Dynamics, I mentioned it before, and my project that summer, all summer, I think I spent 12 months there, was designing ground support equipment, the electricals, the plumbing, the structures of it, and I remember I had to do this big presentation at the end to this expert coming from the US, this very smart guy working at SpaceX, working at Virgin Orbit, and I had to impress him, and so I put a lot of pressure, a lot of stress on myself. And I was impressed and I was surprised when logging onto the meeting at the end of the summer, I see Bruno Geoffrion, a Quebec name. And so I was very pleased to be speaking to a Canadian that was working in the US. And so that was him. And so Bruno's experience comes from spending 8 years at SpaceX, working on the Falcon 1 in 2007 and spending 2 years at Virgin Orbit. As my generation would say, he is an OG. Since then, Bruno Geoffrion came back to Canada in 2022 and founded Moon and Mars Industries out of Vancouver, BC. It is an in-space manufacturing company. It is building first a suborbital rocket to quickly test payloads in flight. The company is also working on the design of a CubeSat to launch on the maiden flight of the vehicle. Bruno is exactly what we need. The opposite of the usual brain drain coming back to us from the US, and is also a great advisor to present to in the summer. So everybody, please welcome our panelists to the stage. Wonderful. So maybe we can start with a roundtable and going from left to right, starting with you, Oleg. In your view, Oleg, what is the biggest technical hurdle currently facing Canadian space launch efforts today, and how do you think we can realistically overcome that in 2025 as a student, as a leader of students currently building the largest Canadian student rocket?
Thank you very much. That's an excellent question.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's in terms of technical hurdles, there's quite a bit, and one of the reasons you can see a lot of people and a lot of things accelerating nowadays than compared to 10, 20 years ago is you have to fight the need to kind of reinvent the wheel every time you want to do something. A lot of the amazing and breakneck progress that you see happening in domestic companies, you know, like Nordspace, or foreign companies like in the United States, you know, you see this kind of explosion that happens when something gets figured out for the first time. So you'll see, you know, SpaceX is successful with their Falcon 1, and now everyone and their grandmother has a rocket company in the US, and they're all quite similar, you know. Same thing here, you know, you have a couple liquid rocket engine hot fires, you know, a couple people designing turbopumps and stuff like that, and all of a sudden now everyone can do it because it's been proven and it's been shown how it's done. So I'd suppose the largest hurdle that we have is lack of experience, but that's very quickly changing. And while it is fun to hire students, and you need to hire students because they're not just cheap, they're also, you know, very inventive and create creative solutions. But you also have to leverage experience and talent and people who have figured out problems and have, you know, a lot of experience and can bring these decades of experience to help reinforce your team. So that's my answer. So
talent, excellent. And I think that's a great segue to Adam. What do you think is our biggest hurdle and how can we solve it?
So, I mean, on the technical front, I think the biggest challenge that you run into with rockets is that they are so multidisciplinary. Just about every area of engineering works its way into building a rocket, and usually at a very advanced level. So you're not fundamentally trying to solve one problem, you're trying to solve 1,000 coupled problems. And that also is made more difficult because one of the big paradoxes of engineering is that when you start the design of something, be it a launch vehicle, a rocket engine, whatever, you make a whole lot of choices right up front, consciously and sometimes unconsciously. And those choices are going to have far-reaching consequences to the final product that you end up with. But when you're going through that exercise, the start of the project is when you know the least. And if you are a company that has been building rockets for decades, then you've built up that in-house knowledge. You know at least somewhat how to make the right choices up front that are going to maximize your chances of getting to where you want to be. If you've never done that, you're sometimes shooting in the dark. And you can very quickly run into a situation where, you know, that design that you thought was brilliant turns out to have some fatal flaw that you just weren't aware of. And by the time you'd come to understand that, it's sort of too late to do anything about it. So a big part of what I've tried to do with Launch Canada is to create an environment that gives students and other interested people the chance to discover this as much as possible up front when the cost of failure is as low as it's ever going to be. Because when a student team decides they want to build the largest student-built rocket, or liquid rocket in the world, the big rocket is going to be the flashy goal that draws them in, but they'll very quickly gain an understanding of all of, or at least some of those challenging coupled problems that underlie it. And so the more they can go through that and discover what the real challenges are, and in some cases what not to do, when the cost of failure is as low as it's ever going to be, the better equipped they're going to be when they go and do it for real.
Great answer. So exposure to challenge and exposure to failure so you can learn how to progress early on and fail forward. Thank you, Adam.
So first I may mention that everything I say is through the glasses of the Elon Musk School of Engineering. from the early days of SpaceX that's greatly influenced, my thinking and a lot of what was said today, actually. To answer your question more directly, I was going to say people also has been difficult. We hire almost exclusively co-op students. Like 95% of our employees are co-op students. So if people are looking for jobs, students in here for September, we're looking also, even maybe a position for the summer. But since Oleg already talked about that, let me talk about the other problem we have, which is infrastructure. And by that, more specifically, in our case, since we do, like a lot of other people here, rocket engine testing, to find a location to test our rocket engine. We currently test in a parking lot of someone who doesn't use their parking lot over the winter, so we can test all winter long. And when the summer comes, which is now, we can't test until September again. So it's hard to run a company when you can only do your business 6 months out of the year. And the worst case on this, if you think about, there is a certain university in British Columbia, one of the large one, maybe the largest one. Their student team could not find a decent place to test, and so they test at the municipal dump. Garbage, this is where they test. And I really think the industry, the government, somebody should be really kind of a little bit ashamed of taking, great students, great people, and just saying, oh, the best we can do for you is just garbage. I think we can do better than that.
I think there's kind of a philosophical thing there, making from one man's trash another one's treasure. So I see like a common trend to all that you're saying is students, right? We're talking about co-ops, we're talking about failing early, and we're talking about building a team and exposure to challenge. So I have a question maybe first for Oleg and Adam, and then I have a follow-up for you, Bruno. When we're addressing these challenges and when we're developing, we're saying in 100 years, so in the 2100s, the future Canadian launch industry, what is the value of today's grassroots student movement in aerospace engineering and in rocketry? What is the value of that, starting with Oleg?
Oh, that's a good question. So I think now is kind of, it's a very interesting time because we're at the beginning, much like when you walk into this museum, you see a little diorama of like a wooden plane that's built in a shed on a farm with pieces of a tractor right next to it. And that's kind of, and you look at that and you think, wow, I could probably do this in my garage. And that's kind of where we are right now in Canada, believe it or not. We're getting out of the garage, and it's a really interesting time because anyone can jump in. So that's fun, A lot of people would probably love to work at SpaceX today, but I feel like a lot more people would love to work at SpaceX when it started. So I think maybe 100 years from now, that's probably what we're going to look back on today.
And Adam, some thoughts about this grassroots movement that you've helped develop and sustain so far?
Yeah, so I think that as part of what is involved in taking a comprehensive approach to building an industry and building new capabilities, you've got to be clear-headed about who those innovators are. And most government policy tends to focus on like academics and on companies. But there is this whole category of innovators that, you can call them grassroots innovators, amateurs, students, that are often overlooked by most policy out there and by most funding opportunities. But if you go back to the beginning of rocket development in the first part of the 20th century, and I'll inject my little bit of history into this, the development of rocket technology was entirely driven by amateurs and hobbyists. Robert Goddard, the inventor of the liquid propellant rocket, was a college lecturer doing this in his spare time. Wernher von Braun, the architect of Germany and later the United States' serious space efforts, got his start as part of an amateur rocket group in Germany called the VFR. His Soviet counterpart, Sergei Korolev, got started in the same way. So this amateur approach to rocketry is not just some, lunatic fringe thing. It was literally the reason why this technology developed in the first place. And we're seeing the same thing happening now in Canada for exactly the same reason. You know, there was a time when there was no such thing as a rocket company. There was no such thing as NASA. The people who blazed that trail generally were a group of sci-fi enthusiasts with a bit of a technical background who were fascinated by those science fiction stories they read and captivated by the idea of the technology that can make them real. And by doing that, by taking this amateur approach, they built the skills that allowed them to go on and create the very first rocket companies and set the groundwork for everything that followed. That, I think, is the fundamental advantage. We're seeing the same thing happening here now.
So what I'm getting from that is all the managers out there, be nice with your co-op students because they might be the next Goddard. And so a question for you, Bruno. We hear about innovation at startups and universities. What do you think needs to change at the policy or funding level to help these early stage Canadian space projects evolve and succeed and scale?
So first, innovation, I think, can be a problem sometimes. A lot of people I've talked, you've mentioned actually sometimes it's not to reinvent the wheel. You've just talked about innovation in a more positive way just a second ago. And we hear about it all the time, right? Innovation is going to save the world. But we have so much to learn in this space world in terms of building, just if you think about a launch vehicle. If you can just imitate, just copy what Europe or the US or Japan is doing and understand what they're doing, we can then at that point kind of build on that and introduce innovation to the system. But these are extremely complex machines. And if we try to introduce innovation when we don't even understand the basics of it, I think that's actually kind of slowing us down sometimes. I think there would be a lot of advantages in people going and just building, this is what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to build a simple rocket. Let's see if we can just get it off the ground without it doing like Polaris Aerospace did a month ago, right? I mean, it was a gorgeous video, gorgeous location, but for those of you who have not seen it, it went up and it went back down very quickly. It was pretty spectacular, but it's to say that it takes a lot to build these machines. I don't know what broke, I don't know if we know yet if it's a control system issue or what, but it's very complicated. So I would encourage sometimes people to go with simple stuff, not reinvent the wheel, not rely on innovation, but quite the opposite. Innovation can be the enemy. Innovation will slow you down. It can be, it's going to cost you more. It's going to take longer. So I don't think that. I think there are moments when people just think about that. There are moments when it's okay, right? When you've got a very specific problem, and you're saying, all right, I've got a new solution, and it's going to solve all the problems of the world, and that's fine. But right now, I think if you think about rockets, there's a lot that we can just, if we can just reproduce what else, what is done elsewhere, that'd be fantastic.
Mm-hmm. And so engineering first, right? Focusing on the engineering. And as a follow-up, as a CEO of a startup in space and in rocketry, what are ways that funding can be better tuned to the needs of a startup in rocketry and aerospace?
Right, so we're really engineering focused. All these words that sometimes people use, like there was a question earlier today about ERP, and I'm going, ERP, oh yeah, that's what that is. You know, and WBS, which seems to be a favorite word of acronym for some people, the work breakdown structure, right? And I applied for an STDP, some funding from STDP that I did not get, by the way, but where they asked for the work breakdown structure, and I'm like, geez, I've worked, you know, all this time in different industry, the chemical industry, the semiconductor industry. No one's ever asked me for the work breakdown structure. I had to look it up and figure out what they wanted. So we have, you know, 5 employees, and that's it. They're all engineers, and everybody's doing this. And I don't have like resources or just to spend time to, for example, write these applications for grants. And like if I take the STDP, for example, right, they've got a category for small business, but it's 50 or less. And I'm going, I'm 5. There's 5 of us. Student, it's probably the same case where it's maybe not the quantity, but the energy, the funding that you have, or the capability to write these very large grants. So simplifying the process, I think it's something that, I can't remember the name, but Raul talked about it. Someone else talked about reducing requirements, reducing the paperwork that needs to be done. And it's a total mindset change. People say it now like, oh, delete the requirement, you know, because they read all Elon's biography, right? Well, that's great. I mean, I'm happy. But it's a way of thinking. It's not like you can't start in terms of thinking about, okay, I need to reduce the requirement. You need to start by saying, there's nothing. Like, don't think about reducing because you're not going to go enough. Start by not writing anything at the start. And it's just not requirements. The entire way that you do, you want to do your purchasing, use an Excel spreadsheet. Don't make yourself difficult. At Virgin Orbit, for example, because it's part of the Virgin Group, they forced us to use the ERP system, which name I can't remember now, but one of the big ones. Well, Virgin Orbit was just like 100 people at the time. And so it added really a burden for everybody for this, what was relatively small company of 100 people, but using this very large ERP because it's integrated with the Virgin Group, right, which is huge. So it made sense to them to do that, but at the small scale, it doesn't. So eliminating as much paperwork, which I think we've said, about 25 times today already, would be useful.
So deleting requirements and trusting the engineering team.
Yeah, but you've got to direct the engineering because engineers very often will want to add widgets or create cool widgets. It's cool to do this stuff. Especially the students. I think when you get a little bit older with experience, you kind of realize sometimes that it's not required. But as students, they sometimes really want to do that. I mean, I need to rein in my guys, right, all the time. Because they want to do something. I'm like, no, we don't need that. or it's guiding people that what is the essential that we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to launch a rocket as fast as possible.
And if Adam, you don't mind, I know you have a few opinions about this topic of funding. Could you share your thoughts? And I know you can maybe talk about the turbopump project and those relationships between public and private partnerships in terms of developing that funding.
Okay, yeah. So kind of along the line of what we talked about in the morning panel, you know, there is this really common tendency within government in particular to treat things like a large procurement. And that model tends to get applied to an awful lot. And don't get me wrong, there are times when you want a really rigorous procurement process because you're buying, you know, next generation fighter jets and you don't want to give the contract to a random startup with no track record. But not everything needs to be treated like that. And you know, the example of NASA's COTS program was a really good one, where they quite consciously set a minimal set of requirements, and then everything else really came as a dialogue between government and the company bidding for it. We need to stop treating all of our funding programs as if they are these, you know, major procurements. There's a place for it, but there's also a place for small amounts of money that are appropriate to early stage technology developments, and don't try to overprescribe requirements for them. This is a big part of, you know, how innovation works in practice. You've got to be able to try things. And trying to plan all of this in advance, trying to pick winners in advance, does not tend to work well. People need the chance to come up with their ideas, try them out, maybe fail, and then learn from that experience. And so we need more funding programs that are amenable to doing that. And you know, if you simultaneously want to support development of low TRL technologies, but you also expect zero risk, you know, this is logically impossible. You can't achieve that. So we've got to make sure that there is funding available for the early stage, higher risk technology development, with the realization that the goal of that is not to come away with a, you know, final product that meets requirements with 99.9% certainty. The goal is to retire as much risk as possible, as early as possible. So that I think is one of the big pieces that does need to come into place. And I think the other thing is we need to make sure that government agencies have a lot more flexibility in what they do to support things. Because normally, you know, if you go to government saying, hey, I want to do this thing, can you support me in doing it? Their initial impulse is going to be to look at what existing programs do we have that we can fit you into. And if you don't fit neatly into any of those boxes, then they tend to be very limited in what they can do. So that is a big thing that really does need to be addressed.
And I think that goes back to what Rahul was saying earlier with the reflex of saying yes and developing that tradition kind of saying yes more and looking at how we can make those things happen. And can you maybe touch onto private and public partnerships and how those can be a form of an avenue for funding for technology development opportunities in Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, what we are doing is incredibly multidisciplinary. Government has an important role to play, but so does the private sector. And in our small way with Launch Canada, this is exactly how we operate. We are all about trying to unite industry players as well as government to create an environment that is as supportive as possible for developing these kinds of new technologies. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to do this more, but we've certainly found that a lot of companies do understand how valuable these things can be. They get that this is a unique way to develop new technologies at the lowest possible cost. It would be nice if we could leverage more government supports as well and kind of bring them into this to do that in a larger way.
I agree. And Oleg, so a theme that comes back often is funding. And as leader of a team of 100 students and many years of you personally working on the project, what are some strategies that other student teams or other design teams that are not privately funded, that are in academic institutions, what are strategies that they can find to fund those efforts and continue that technology development if they're not necessarily supported by the government?
Never give up, never surrender.
Good.
No, but no, it's an excellent question. Yeah, no, it's just be tenacious, be persistent, be resilient, and you got to be like water. You got to find the leak. Just got to keep looking for it. It's out there. Money is, believe it or not, it's funny to say, but money is the easiest thing in the world to come by because, well, we all got to do it to live, right? We got to eat food, sleep, pay rent somehow. So it is possible to get money. How? There's a million different ways, So you just got to be creative. Just because it's normally done one way doesn't mean it's the only way to do it, And who knows? You might tap into something that's completely new and different and works really well for you. So depends on your situation. There's no one size fits all, unfortunately, but it's always tough, but that's not necessarily a bad thing because if you're good with things in hard times, then you're great with things in good times. So.
Bruno, I see you have an addition.
Yeah, this morning there was a nice article on the launch sites in Canada and how many we should have. And I think the right question is not how many we should have. The question is how much should we pay for them? And Cornwall was meant, the Cornwall lady, which I can't see anymore, but was mentioning how they paid 12 million pounds for the Cornwall launch site. SpaceX Kwajalein also cost $12 million, pounds, dollars, it's all the same. $12 million, and I think here in Canada, what we should go for is to say we want a simple launch site that costs $12 million or less. Less might be hard, but that's $12 million. And that's where the government, if the government wants to invest in a launch site, it should not be more than 12 million. Because when it goes, we can do it at that price. It's simple. It's a slab of concrete with some surrounding equipment. But the point is that you want to limit. I don't want a large amount of money by the government invested in something that then will not, will be underused, and it's sucking the energy and it's sucking the money from other projects that could be made. So the answer is not 0, 1, 2, 3, or 5. It's 12 million. Is the answer to Mark's question.
And so, maybe starting with Bruno, any rocket needs a launch site. What is the one advice you would have to share to a team launching and looking for a site?
Yeah, we got about 90 seconds left. Go cheap, go easy. You don't need anything. You don't need anything fancy. I could name sites not to go to, but pretty much look for the site that looks the most like a pad of concrete, a slab of concrete in the middle of the desert. There are at least 2, right? There's New Mexico, at least in Australia.
We have a couple of slabs of concrete in Canada. We can make that happen.
Sure, regulation will fix all that, and
Yes.
we'll be able to go.
Adam, one piece of advice for students trying to develop very advanced engineering projects in Canada in 20 seconds.
Okay, so I mean, you have tremendous scope to pick whatever aspect of this technology interests you the most. So don't be afraid to go with what excites you, and know that there are those of us who are here to support you and help move whatever particular mountains need to be moved. If it's something that motivates you, then you will go above and beyond to make it happen. And that's exactly the kind of attitude that we need to be cultivating here.
I agree. We are go-getters. Let's do it. And Oleg, for universities and academic institutions, if you were to speak to your university today or any other university in Canada, what would you tell to the Dean of Engineering or the academic institution to encourage them and to encourage their students to develop that technology at home?
So if I was speaking to anyone who's in charge of a bunch of students or in a position where they can support a bunch of students, I would say do anything you can to get roadblocks out of their way. You know, find a way to support them and give them what they need, not what they think they need. You know, listen to them, understand their problems, and try to find solutions for them, because too much time is stuck trying to get sticks out of your wheels rather than riding on the track. And at the end of the day, that's what they're trying to do. So that's my advice to them.
Bruno?
So I know we're completely running out of time. Is that the last, if we're at the end over here, just the break is coming with the drinks and stuff. Just to think about, what do you want the Canadian space industry to look like in the next 10, 20 years? What do you want that to include? And maybe this is something we can talk about, you know, around a beer or whatever you'd like to drink. But from my perspective, I'd like, in the next 10, 20 years at the most, right, rockets, satellites, space stations, capsules. But the thing I don't see in that time period is human spaceflight. I don't see us necessarily participating more into the Artemis program, for example. What I also don't see are rovers to the moon or Mars, I know to name my company, rovers of some sort, right? And believe me, I mean, what I like the most about space would be, it's to launch people and to go to Mars. But I think with the limited capability we have in the next 10 and 20 years, I think these are things that it's so much money to spend on human spaceflight. So my favor is, again, satellite, capsule, space stations, and obviously not human space station, not habited, and rockets.
So let's focus on the basics first, and let's launch some Canadian rockets out of Canadian soil. Everybody, please, warm round of applause for our panelists.